Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll start now. Welcome to the Open Data Institute. My name is Anna Scott. I'm the editor here, and I'm delighted to welcome Andy Hamflett and Simon Raper for today's Friday lunchtime lecture. Andy joins us from AAM Associates and Simon from Capellia, and today they'll be talking about the work they've done for the Trussell Trust Foodbank Network and how data might be the latest weapon in our fight against hunger. If you'd like to join the conversation online, you can use the hashtag ODI Fridays, and there'll be some time for questions at the end if you have any. And for those listening online, if you have questions, you can also ask with the hashtag ODI Fridays, and we'll be sure to ask them at the end. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, I'm Andy. And thank you for having us here. And a little wave to, I believe Leeds ODI are in here as well, so a little wave to everyone in Leeds. We're here to tell you the project we've been doing in about the past year, which is looking at data within foodbank networks. I'm going to take you through how we got to data. So it didn't actually start out either as an open data project or actually an analytics project. So just take you through those early formative parts of the project, mainly so we can learn a bit about the main client, which is the Trussell Trust. So the project was actually it was a research project in partnership with Hull University, funded by RC UK, and it was to explore the potential of digital technologies within foodbank networks. So we got the money and we approached the Trussell Trust to say, can we play around with this? And the Trust itself is a foodbank network. It's the largest UK foodbank network. They work on a social franchise model, so they have an operation, and mainly churches locally decide there's a need in their area for, there's a big area around food poverty, and then they engage with the Trust to use their models and use their brand and use their networks and all the support they give to enable local delivery to happen. But generally, their mission is to empower local communities to combat poverty and exclusion. And when we get to the later parts, those 2 points there about poverty and exclusion, you'll notice they don't actually say food. It's not about food, it's about fighting poverty, which becomes really important later on in the project. And just a second thing on the Trust, those of you who've been following the press, it's been kind of like a touchstone for the austerity crisis in the UK, where food banks have risen exponentially over the past 5 or 6 years. That's 2 years in a row now, the latest stats there on 2015-16, where they've provided over 1 million food parcels a year. So that's not 1 million individual people, that's 1 million parcels of 3 days worth of emergency food. So there may be some duplicates in there, but still an astonishing number from where you look at where they'll be. And then organisationally, because we're here to try and help them as an organisation to use data and use technology to really fight what they're going to do. They've also gone through a really, really rapid growth, so from well under 1 million to well over 7 million in 4 or 5 years. And it's quite a good story for them actually to be able to be on top of that and grow as a charity and keep on top of it. So rapid growth, trying to counter poverty in the local area. So we did 2 things as part of the early part of the research. The first one was with Giles Hindle and Richard Vidgen from Hull University, and they used operational research methods to do some business modelling. So we did loads of workshops, talked to the Trussell Trust and the local food bank managers, many of whom are volunteers, just to work out what is it you do, how do you progress through food through your networks, and mainly we were looking for the holes in the road. So I won't go into too much detail, but that was it. It was a business modelling about just to get under the skin of what the charity is all about. And then we, on the other side of the research, did loads of technology research. So we were looking for technologies which were being used or being explored in foodbank networks globally. We found about 60 or 70 of them, and some really interesting stuff in there. There's one. It's a very simple online volunteer management system where I'm a volunteer. I can log in and just book the sessions that I'm going to come in and man and person those sessions, rather than having to go through a volunteer and do diary management. So simple technologies were there. The point of doing these 2 pieces of research was to look at mainly the holes in the road that there were in their operation. Where are you struggling? Where are you stretched? Where isn't it going brilliantly? What's happening over in the technology world that might be able to plug those gaps to make a big difference, to sort of fit them in? And then we had some money to actually go and build something. But what we found, actually, is that 2 things. One, they're a really well-run network. They plough pallets and pallets and tons of food to the network, so that's well done. They are well set up with volunteers. They're growing. So there wasn't anything jumping out immediately to say, actually, technologies are also listed up here. So we started then to look at their broader strategy. And as any good charity would be, they all start to think, well, how do we design ourselves out of this? We're here to meet an urgent and need and a crisis, which we don't particularly want to be there. So what is our role in actually helping people come to us for food once and get that emergency supply, but then not come to us again? So they're starting to explore their More Than Food initiative, which is about understanding them as one player in a connected network of people trying to fight poverty. So that's where it is. And then we started to think, well, if that's what you're trying to do, what you need to do more is understand the people who come to you all the time. And that's what led us to explore data. And we took a few examples to them around where data analysis, in fairly small ways, have started to help charities understand what they've done. So Buttle UK is a funder in the UK, and a great organisation you'll know called DataKind did this work, I think. And so they provide small grants to people in crisis. They did a text analysis survey of all of the applications that came into them, and they found some really interesting things using some data science methods. One outcome was, two outcomes. One, they realised that if bedwetting is mentioned in one of those applications, it's a real strong indicator that these guys might need to be fast-tracked, that something there that seemed to suggest that they would do it. And then they started to tweak their application process where they could see really early on, these might be some people who are really in need. So just again, an early stage understanding of data analysis. Very simply, visualization. You know, what I should have said earlier on is the Trust have been really, really good at collecting data. From a very small charity, they set up their lines in the sand quite early on to say, we're going to collect data. It's been really, really helpful for them in the policy agenda to try and take this out. And as you said, those million numbers, they travel far in the press twice a year when they bring stuff out. But we just took this little example of, this is someone just using a commercial data visualization platform, Tableau, and it was a teenage pregnancy advice group in the States, and they just said it just transformed the way we could work as a team, looking at not just our data, but other data out there. So rather than have someone sitting in a back office looking through the Excel spreadsheets and putting it out, everyone could play with it. We could look at it in meetings and actually sort of do stuff with it. And then finally, obviously on the edges, just to start to tease about predictive modeling, and this is a fairly well-known example from New Orleans. And they piped a load of open data into helping them design an outreach strategy. And I think the two things they looked, just reminding myself, so they found the houses that were least likely to have a smoke alarm in their house and the most likely to suffer fatalities because of fire. We've got limited resources, that's where we're going to put them. It's a fairly simple data analysis, which comes with some quite interesting stuff. And so at that point, we thought, hang on, you've got data, you know what your mission is, what can we do? And this is where Simon came in from Cabelia.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, I'm a statistician, or data scientist as we're now widely known, but I was brought in by Andy to, partly sort of inspired by those maps that you just saw, particularly around the predictive analysis that those guys were doing those maps, to see if we could replicate or sort of take forward the work that had been done there, but using the Trussell Trust data. As Andy says, the data there was very rich. It was both sort of temporally rich. I mean, they've been gathering data daily since for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and spatially very rich as well, because they'd logged the locations of the people using the food banks, and they'd classified them by electoral ward. So there was fantastic data to be done there. With our eyes on the idea of developing this tool, we first did some preliminary analysis of the data. And this is, as I'm sure you realize, it's an important first stage in any of these projects, because in order to understand your sort of direction and what can be done, it's important to get this kind of overall general picture. And very often organizations can be very good at collecting data, but they don't necessarily use all the tools that they can to see it. So one of the first things we did was some quite simple stuff. We just broke down their vouchers by the crisis, because people log their crisis on there. They'll say if the use of the food vouchers was due to benefit delays or homelessness. And then we just kind of, for example, in this graphic here, we just cut it by region. I know I'm going to trip over this. So I don't know whether you can see here, it all looks kind of the same to begin with, but when you start to look carefully at what's going on, you can see some quite interesting patterns. So for example, in the southeast, low income is much more of a factor than in other areas. And in, say, the north and the east, there are issues, many more issues to do with benefit delays. So that, for a start, was quite interesting for them. We presented a number of different slides on the things that were going on, including time series analysis. Now, you know, it's a very simple thing to do, but they actually hadn't seen it in this level of detail. So, for example, you can see the growth over time, and you can see the pattern that occurs around Christmas time. So that was immediately food for thought, because what seems to be happening here is people needing to use many more food parcels prior to Christmas, and then there's some kind of slump. Did they identify the reason in the end for that slump?
I think all of these things had prompted them to go and look at it in greater detail. But they thought, you don't want to be without food over Christmas, secondly. But then they also thought that they wanted to look at the opening hours. There's quite a lot of food banks which are volunteer-led. Obviously, they want to spend time with their families as well. So that mix of people knowing the food bank was going to be closed probably led to that spike.
And then there was the general levelling off, which was quite interesting. And lots of questions arose out of this. What was behind the initial expansion? Was it just the food banks opening up that increased the overall volumes, new locations, etc., or was there increased usage of the food banks? So lots of different projects kind of span off that initial analysis. So, yeah, the point there was just to say, I haven't done one of these things with builds before. I rarely use PowerPoint. Okay, so the point there was just how important that initial preliminary analysis is. We then formulated our goals for this mapping tool. And one of the most important things, obviously, was to make use of maps to understand the geographical locations. So a very powerful tool for seeing patterns in data, and they're not nearly used enough. We then also wanted to make use of all the open data that's out there, particularly because, as you'll see, we would like to relate some of the demographic data captured by the census to the food bank usage data. But more important, I mean, those are things, those are sort of general objectives, but we also wanted to create something that was useful to the Trussell Trust, both at a high end, sort of at the head office level, where they could see the overall patterns of usage in the country, and also for the individual food bank managers, so that they could see locally what was going on. And we also wanted to see where it's being used, and also how far each food bank had an influence. So what was the furthest direction that somebody had come from to use a particular food bank? Obviously, you can see that could have big implications for the way in which they expand their network. If people are going a long way to use a food bank, then maybe they needed to open a new branch. We wanted to make sure that it was usable through a browser, because browsers these days are probably the most effective way of delivering anything. And also it means that we could ensure that the tool was usable all the way across the Trussell Trust, because everybody's got a browser. And we wanted to ensure that whatever solution we built was easily extendable. So we used lots of conventions that people developing software use to ensure that somebody can come along and plug in new components into the work. So here we go. This is the tool that we eventually built. It's a prototype, but it was fairly smooth by the time we got to it. What you can't get from the static image, but you'll see from the video, is it's very much zoomable. So you can zoom right into a town, see the streets, and zoom out again, and the usage patterns will be there. You've got, I'll explain. You've got a control panel down here, and I'll explain what this stuff goes over here on this side as we go in through the next slides. But you can slide down the opacity of the heat map and see the towns and villages underneath as well. So here we go. So just to talk a bit more about the functionality, you can see we've ticked actual usage here. Now we are highlighting in darker blue those electoral wards where usage is highest per head. So they can immediately see where their zones are. It hasn't come out so brilliantly here, but the orange circles are the actual food banks as well. So you can see the usage around a food bank. You can also click in and select, I think we've just truncated the picture here, but we can select a different crisis type. So here we've gone for, which one was it? Was it something like homelessness?
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, so we can toggle in the different crisis types and see the different maps for the different types of problems that people were having when they're using the vouchers. And then here you see some functionality which we use this is the reach stuff. So we are selecting a particular food bank, and we're seeing that here it is, right there, Hornsey or something like that, and this is how far people have come to use that food bank, using the actual voucher data. And finally, as a bit of an experiment, we used the Google API to work out the travel reach from each food bank, so we could see how far people using different types of transport, whether they're walking, whether they were using trains or driving, how far they could come in 30 minutes. Absolutely.
How far in average do they come from?
Sorry, what's that?
Do you have an average? How far do they come from?
I don't know, no. But so I mean, that would be interesting to look at actual distances and go and reverse it. So to take the actual people and say, how far did it take you to go? That would be a brilliant thing for our next phase. But this was kind of the other way around. This was, how far can you get to in 30 minutes, if you see what I mean? So that's a really good one to look at next time. So, but I think the most powerful and interesting from a data perspective use for the Trussell data combined with the census data was our predictive tool. We pulled a whole bunch of different measures from the ONS site about the census from 2011, stuff like deprivation indexes, employment, the percentage of the people who are in part-time employment or low-paid work, health stuff, amount of people who are having to care for others, any indicator that we thought might have some kind of relevance for food bank usage. Then we used that data, having married it up, because we got ward-level data, electoral ward-level data for the Trussell Trust and electoral ward-level data for the census, married it up, and then built a model, not a perfect statistical model, but a fully functional, usable one, which tried to predict which areas would have high food bank usage from the indicators. That way, we could then use the model and say, which areas do we predict would have food bank usage but don't have food bank usage? So it's a very useful contrast for the Trussell Trust. They can toggle between actual use and predicted use. If you like, the predicted indicator was just a very sensible index of those measures from the census that are highly predictive of food bank usage. So is it back to you?
I think so, yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Cheers, Simon. So all this is very interesting. And there were lots of oohs and ahs when they first saw the map. The Trussell Trust staff were with us, obviously, all the way through. But how can this be useful to them? So first of all, just on location, and again, you can't see all of these. I'll put all the three locations up. So all of this obviously sits in an Excel spreadsheet, but until you see it like this, you would never think, oh, that postcode's a long way away. So all of these things are trying to make them understand, are we placed in the right area? So for example, in that first one, they're right up at the top right there, but loads of people seem to be coming from a long way away. So there's that one. Other ones that we looked at as well, we're also looking at, why are so many people passing other food banks to get to us? Is that a communications issue? Is it they don't know about that? Or were they just here visiting friends? What is it? So let's look at that in greater detail to see how are we as a network working together to allow people to receive the support they need as close to home as possible. And similar in that middle one. So you can see the greater usage is way up in the sort of in the northwest part of that little grid. So all of them, it was great. We presented this at the National Food Bank Conference, and there was a big queue of people wanting to play around with their area. Go, oh, I want to see where people are coming from and how can we change. And so that's where the interesting bit comes in. Then you've got some other ideas to look at. So again, this is up in the northwest of England, I think. So again, they hadn't realised when they looked at this quite how much of an issue homelessness was. So this is where you start to move into them as strategic operators. So if homelessness is a big issue for the people who are coming to us, what do we do with that? How does this fit into the more than food thing? Who do we need to engage with? What other homeless agencies would die for this information? What is it that we do to play a part as a strategic partner rather than just giving people food and then sending them off again and hoping they don't come back? So again, visualising this is really important to actually, what's the greatest need and areas of crisis in our area that we should be looking at in greater detail? Similar there. And then you start to think about them as strategists, and not just about thinking through providing food, but anyone who looks at that and thinks, school holiday meals, kids can't get fed in school, because obviously they get free school meals during the school term, but then once you're out of that, you're cut off and you're on your own. That is a really powerful lobbying tool to go to local authorities, to go to local funders, to go to everyone and say, look, this is what we're up against in the summer holidays. Can you help us? Can you provide fundraising? Who else do we need to work with? So again, just the visualization of the trouble they're trying to sort out is really, really helpful. But as Simon said, I think the predicted need area is where it should possibly have the greatest strategic input for them as a corporate body. Because go back to the earlier slide, their whole model was based on a social franchise network where local churches see the need, start to meet that need, and then it sort of comes up this way. What they've got now is a different view of the country they're operating in, where they can see really big blotches of dark blue where they think, we're going to be needed here, what do we do? And then actually you start to think, well, is the thing to just go and rush there and start up food banks? And I carry around in my head a shocking statistics. We talked to a few of the American food banks, and they're absolutely enormous, but I didn't realize how big. Feeding America, for example, turned over $1.8 billion last year, which is enormous and shocking and incredible and hard to get your head around. But just tracking that story back, in the late 70s, food poverty was massive in the States. And so this raft of charities stepped up to the plate. But now they're part of the system and they're embedded. So you couldn't possibly take them out now, because what would all those people do? Does the Trussell Trust want to do that? Do they want to rush to meet that need, and then actually they're there forever and they're part of the state provision almost? So they've got some really interesting strategic issues to work here, all aligned to their More Than Food initiative, which is okay. We attract people because they need food, because they're in crisis. Once we're here with them, then what? So they've now commissioned more university research to think about their More Than Food initiative, to think how data plays a role into it, and actually think about how they can act as part of a network of anti-poverty charities to take stuff forward. So that's the really exciting bit. And then if you just sort of step away, and I'm happy to talk to everyone, we've got loads of ideas about how to take this forward. We're going to continue working with the Trussell Trust themselves to take Simon's brilliant prototype and get it into a working tool for all the local food banks, because once it's in their hands, they'll find a million things to do with it, we know. So we'll take that forward. But I'm perhaps more interested in this as a model for what other charities might do. And I just pulled up 2 slides there. So that's where we are, and those are all the local charities in the area where they're based. The wealth of information that they're sitting on and not looking at is absolutely enormous. And already you can see if 2 or 3 of them in one area have postcode data related to the crisis type they've got, put all those together and you've got a really rich picture of poverty and crisis from the bottom up, which you can then align with all the open data. So just stick Hackney into the London data store and you've got 56 data sets. So there's going to be something I think really, really important for most charities in the middle there. Let's work out what your data is, who else can share some stuff with you, and then where's the open data on top of that. So that's where we've got to. And we're very, very pleased to take some pictures. I'm just going to, so you can see this working, I'm just going to play this in the background so you can see it zooming in and out and doing its thing. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you so much. It's super interesting. Has anyone got any questions? Yeah.
I had a question about the predictive need part of it. So you mentioned how the rise in use of food banks was really linked to sort of austerity and also the welfare policy. It's something that Ian Duncan Smith sort of got really angry with. Ian Duncan Smith got really angry with the Trussell Trust for he said they were politicising the issue or something. And I wondered whether, as part of your model, you could factor in sort of future legislative changes. So if there was a proposed future cut in benefits or something like this, whether you could model what effect that might have on a particular region or a particular area as a sort of strategic tool for opposing these sorts of changes.
Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll talk about the modelling, but you can do the politics.
Okay, fine. Good.
Yeah, what we didn't mention is we had a few sort of spin-off projects where we looked at a sort of dynamic model of the growth. We had planned to look at things like the type of causes that you'd mentioned, looking at the impact of different policies to do with the supply of benefits. But we found in the end that we first wanted to answer some difficult questions about what was fueling the growth in the food banks as a system in general. So it was quite difficult to just look at whether or not growth was due to the food banks increasing, the number of food banks increasing, rather than just for the demand. If you can imagine that's quite that's a model with two moving parts, and you have to separate the two of them. So we didn't get on yet to looking at the impact of the policies on the time series. I think that is a very good area to look at, and I think Andy's probably got some ideas about whether or not we'll be looking at in the second phase.
I think we're okay with this one.
Oh, yeah. Why am I doing this?
Sing us a song. Sing us a song if you want.
We got a lot of feedback.
I think two things on that. Yeah, we were poking around. What was really interesting in this, as we were presenting loads of really exciting pictures to them, as with a lot of these kind of projects, it kind of confirmed stuff they kind of half knew already. You know, so for example, related to this, not directly, when there were a few spikes in one of those charts, they were, why is that? And they thought maybe that is because actually we're part of a referral network. As I said earlier, everyone gets referred to them and they have to take a voucher and do all that kind of stuff. So people can only get to them if those referral agencies are still there. And a lot of advice bureaus, you know, they were closing down. So things started to cool down on the ground, and I think, well, why is this? But seeing those spikes where they are, first of all said yes, and then they said, well, again, started to think exactly yourself, how do we prepare ourselves for the future? What is it that led to those advice centres closing down, and then any number of things. If we know stuff's happened here, how can we just get on the front foot and prepare? And I think the second part of that is what we're hoping to do next, is engage with government agencies. This isn't about bashing any government about austerity. This is about saying this is a problem that seems to be real. It's in your best interest to help and sort it. It's in ours. It's in everyone. So how can we come together and, with your deep understanding of the data you have, how can we work together on this? And that's what we're hoping to do in the next few months.
My name is Isabel, and I'm a data journalist. And I was wondering, when did they start collecting the data, and did you find any interesting findings through times? I was thinking to aging of the population, or that sort of thing that would be reflected in the characteristics of families, or like people asking for food packages, or anything really.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, we did do some. We did look at there is an issue in the fact that the demographic data that they capture could be richer at this point. So there's a limit to the kind of questions we could ask of it at the moment, but I think they're planning on expanding it. But we did see things like different regional patterns, where perhaps the winter had a greater effect in the north than it did in the south, stuff like that. There was also some interesting relationships between the population density and the food bank usage. So we found that extreme ruralness was an issue. So the big outliers in terms of usage, those places where the demand was very, very heavy, seem to be in the rural areas. But like all research things, our research ended in a more investigation is needed kind of proviso, because we're really doing this as a stepping stone onto building the tool and to open up questions.
I think what I just add to that is they've been great at collecting the data, and they were already thinking about what more data do we need to collect, but this might give them a little bit of a push. So they're now moving to an e-referral system, don't you know this, where it will automatically pipe into the stuff, and they're starting to work, well, how can we, rather than just saying, are you over 18 or under 18, what kind of divisions can we get in there? And I think thinking, I've worked in charities a lot all my life, and what's interesting, data collection, it's not particularly sexy or liked by anyone. And you fill stuff in, and you're at the coalface, you fill it in, and you send it off, and we'll never see that again, the funders want it, and that's it. What's different about this is the local food banks can see what it's going into, and it comes back to them, and they can play with it. It's a tool for them. And once you've got that virtual loop, I think it's really important for everyone to want to collect more data.
And I'd just add as well, the variables that correlated with the food bank usage, when you start drill into them, they're very interesting too. So, for example, like Andy says, they tend to confirm what you'd think, but the very fact that they do does take the conversation forward. So, for example, the summer holiday usage, what's it called again? Child
holiday meals.
Child holiday meals, that seemed to be correlated with people in part-time work or low-paid work. So you could see that that was an issue there.
Hi, I'm Larisa. I'm from Brazil, from Rio ODI node, and that will be very interesting to be replicated in Brazil. But I have some questions. What do you think the hurdles? Because not only the tool, but the data collection. Because you said the trust had a lot of data collected. So what do you suggest first steps if you want to replicate that in our country is to find out what data is available, or because it seems very organized, not organized, but a lot of data, so you organize it in a way we could visualize, but I would like to hear a little bit about what you suggest for other realities.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, and then Simon maybe put some technical stuff on it. What I found is really useful is just going to people with a range of case studies. Because data itself, it's quite scary. Lots of people don't have the technical understanding, neither do I. But once you start seeing half a dozen or a dozen things that other people have done, like the bottle and like the other stuff, and just present that to charities, then that gives them a really good route in to thinking, we could do that, or we could do that. And it might not be this answer, it might not be a mapping tool, but just giving, and the ODI is great at pumping this stuff out, take case studies to people, and then that will drive them to think, what is the data we collect? Could we do that? Could we do that? Could we do the other? Because one size doesn't fit all. I would say pointing to what others have done and starting there would be the best place, maybe.
And I also add that the geospatial stuff, in terms of the mapping that's available, is very well developed throughout the entire geographical map, so a map of the world. So wherever you are, it's fairly straightforward to be able to produce something as kind of visually striking and interactive in that way. And then whatever you've got, that could be plotted over that data to inspire people so that they could see what the potential is. And then that might, as Andy said, get people moving in terms of collecting.
And I think I just said
data.
It's not easy. And again, data has this, whether it's open data or closed data, it has a bad rep within most social organisations for lots of reasons. So that thing I was saying earlier about closing that loop where people can see the value of it is really important. One other quick example, there's a great book I read a couple years ago about a school over in California, I think, and they wanted to be data informed. So they collected loads and loads of data, but very quickly worked their way around to saying, we've got to use this and show this. And the example they did was they looked across the performance of individual pupils and found that two lads were way down in this subject, and they're up here on everyone else. So they had built a data culture where they could take that to the teacher and say, we need to explore this, don't we? So he invited a couple of other teachers in to view his lessons to try and find out what it was. Then they came back again and videoed him, and he looked at it and said, I'm shouting at them. Why am I shouting at them? Why am I doing that? And next stage, once he was a Hispanic teacher, they were Hispanic kids, and he wanted to drill in them, you've got to do better, you've got to do better. He was actually forgetting his best practice in doing that. So that is a virtual loop of data where everyone's comfortable with it. They know it's there to support you, and people are there to sort of get to the good part. And that's not easy, but that's the kind of thing you need to be aiming for, I'd say.
I have a related question, actually, to the sort of feedback loop that you were talking about. You mentioned earlier that maps aren't used nearly enough to represent data and see data. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think it's because, well, this is my total guess, but that the kind of journals that used to that statistics sort of came out in would typically show a time series because it's easy to produce. And the software that was previously needed to visualize data on a map was expensive and took time. And now that's just broken down entirely because, as I said in another talk recently, it's all there for anybody to use. You just need to have a little bit of JavaScript knowledge, a little bit of coding knowledge, and you can do it. So I think and I think because of that sort of historical chain of events, people aren't used to doing it. They forget that it's there. There's a thing which you have to be careful of with maps in that they can be a little bit misleading in the sense that you might get one block of the country absolutely purple because it's a large rural expanse. So I think there are statistical reasons for being careful with using maps, and that might help people back a bit. But I think that's not an obstacle that can't be overcome. So.
And my view on that from an organisational side would be yes, it's becoming a lot easier from what I understand. Again, not a technologist. But again, a lot of social organisers are trapped in the data's so scary. We don't have the technology. We're struggling anyway in the current crisis. We don't, where's the stories on return on investment? What do we know? So that they're not coming to it easily. First of all, I'd say. And then if you look at maps generally, even the really good funders, they'll do a map or they'll do lots of maps, and then it'll be in a report that is published once a year. The difference with this and the difference with the Tableau example earlier on with the teenage pregnancies is you can engage with it. You can look at it. You can play with it. And that's actually will drive you to ask more questions and take that conversation rather than reading a report going, oh, what do we do with that? I'd say.
Well, unless there are any other questions, I think we'll wrap up. Please join me in thanking Andy and Simon for coming.
Thank you very much. Good.
Just to let you know that we will also be recording a podcast on this issue later today, so we'll be going into a little bit more detail, and you are welcome to listen to that when it's online in a couple of weeks. Our next Friday lunchtime lecture next week will be on Thinking Out Loud, which is our Data is Culture for Art exhibition. So hope to see you then. Thank you.